This is the second part of my largest winning session. I've been playing on the Prime stream almost every Friday since, and I plan on regularly adding this stream content in addition to my standard vlogs. I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks for tuning in. This hand occurs immediately after the Ace of Diamonds, Jack of Diamonds hand. We see a open from Reagan to $15 from early position. I decide to flat King of Spades, 10 of Spades from middle position. I think generally my hand plays okay multi-way. I think that Reagan is opening relatively wide, but he should also be pretty strong when he is opening from under the gun. So I think a flat is perfectly fine here. Hassan calls behind in the hijack with Queen of Diamonds, 9 of Diamonds, and we see a 3-bet by Bang to $105 with Ace King off. Reagan folds and it gets to me. I decide to make the call. I think my hand is still pretty strong, and I think that Bang has been very aggressive thus far, and my hand has decent equity against the majority of his range. Hassan calls behind and we go to a flop with a pot of $337. The flop is the 8 of Diamonds, King of Hearts, 2 of Spades. So we flop top pair against Bang's top pair, top kicker. We check and flow, Hassan checks, and Bang bets $150 from the cutoff. My hand is a pretty clear call here, especially multi-way, so I do proceed with a call. I'm often going to be putting in a lot of money here against Bang just because he is overly aggressive, so I expect to be calling down a decent amount of turns and rivers. Hassan folds behind and we go to a turn with a pot of $637. The turn is the 10 of clubs, giving me top 2 pair. At this point, I'm really never folding, and I'm hoping Bang just puts the rest of the money in. Bang does continue once I check to him. He bets 425 into 637. I think against this specific player that is aggressive, I only want to be calling here, allowing him to bluff when he misses any of his draws on the river, and allowing him to put it in with hands like aces and ace king. I do make the call, and the pot is $1,500. The river is a brick 3. I check and Bang shoves all in for $1,100. He shows the ace king and I show the top 2 pair. And we pick up another pot this session. Richard opens King Jack offsuit from early position. It folds around to me in the straddle, and I complete with Jack of clubs, 9 of clubs. We go to a flop for $67. The flop is the 4 of diamonds, 3 of clubs, 4 of clubs. I check and Richard decides to check back. I think in a lot of positions, King Jack off is going to be a high frequency check back on these kind of boards. But I think this board specifically should be a range bet by Richard when he is opening early position. He has a very massive range advantage on this board with all of his overpairs, and although the somewhat connected small paired board looks relatively good for big blinds range in a lot of situations, I'm going to have a lot less 4x here than I would if he was opening in a later position. And so ultimately I have a ton of air on this board that has to just fold versus a lot of aggression. All of his overpairs will still gain value from my pairs, straight draws, and flush draws. But we go to a turn. The turn is the Queen of Spades. On this turn card, I'm going to be pro betting at a very low frequency. The Queen of Spades is generally going to be a card that hits Richard's range much harder, as if he did check back here, most of his combos would be in the Broadway region. If I do decide to pro bet here, I'm going to be using a higher frequency of overbet sizes or very small sizes. I think that generally I'm going to be overbetting here with a lot of my 4x combos, and then in terms of bluffs, I'm going to be using straight draw combos and some frequency of flush draw combos here. I think my specific hand is going to be a much higher frequency bet versus the rest of my range. And I do decide to take the overbet line, and I bet $90 into 67. Richard thinks for a little while and folds. In this hand, we have a double straddle to $20 instead of the standard $10 straddle that we have been playing the majority of the night. It folds around to Courtney on the button, and he calls $20 with ace-7 suited. Reagan opens up to $150, which is definitely on the large size as a open raise here, even with a limper. I believe at the time I thought the open was initially $75, not $150. It gets to me in the straddle, and I look down at ace of spades, jack of diamonds. This is not a hand that I want to be playing multi-way. I think that Reagan is opening a pretty wide range here in the small blind. Thus far, he has been relatively aggressive, although I think that he is definitely a solid winning player. I 3-bet to $300, which is on the large side if he had opened to 75, and definitely on the small side if he opens to 150. I would have raised larger than $300 even versus this large opening size, but in hindsight, I am not positive if I knew that his open was 150 versus 75. I think I definitely realize it post-flop though, but at this point, it kind of is what it is. He makes the very easy call for $150 more, and we go to a flop with the pot at $645. The flop is the 2 of diamonds, 6 of diamonds, jack of spades. We flop top pair, top kicker, and a backdoor flush draw. Reagan checks to me, and I have a hand that is going to want to c-bet the majority of the time. On this board, in a 3-bet pot, I'm generally going to be sizing up to around 60%. It's a spot where Reagan has to call the majority of his hands that have overcards and backdoors, in addition to a pair or any of his pocket pairs. I continue for $350 into 645, and Reagan makes the call. We go to the turn with the pot at $1,300, and the turn is the king of clubs. I'm still going to have a pretty strong nut advantage here, as I do have more of the overcards and stronger king X, in addition to having hands like pocket jacks, pocket kings, pocket aces that Reagan is unlikely to have. Although Reagan can definitely have some king X hands, most of them are going to be hands that contain a diamond in them. Although I think it's reasonable for him to call hands like king queen on this flop. Overall, I think this is a turn that I can decide to size down with some of my range, because I do think that it is difficult for Reagan to continue. The vast majority of his range here is going to be jack X and weaker pairs. Therefore, the king really diminishes the value in a lot of those hands. Because of this, I decide to continue for $450 into 1,300. Reagan thinks for a little bit before folding. I think a fold is very standard here. I think he can continue at some frequency if he had the 5 of diamonds blocking some of my flush draws from completing, but I don't think that having 4th pair in a 3-bet pot warrants a continue at much frequency. I open up 6 of hearts, 5 of hearts to $40 in the cutoff. This hand is going to generally be a mix. I think that a lot of people are opening suited connectors a little bit too much, even in these later positions, but I think it's fine either way. Richard looks down at ace of clubs, 7 of hearts in the small blind, and he decides to 3-bet to $105. I think the sizing is much too small out of position. Generally, I would be sizing up to 4.5x when I'm out of position here. I think anything at 3x and above is probably fine, but for this price, I'm always going to be continuing with a suited connector here. I do make the call, and we go to a flop for $225. The flop is the king of spades, 4 of hearts, king of hearts. We flop a flush draw. Richard continues for $75 into 225. This is going to be a board that is going to be c-bet for a pure small bet sizing. So Richard's sizing here is very good. Versus this sizing, my hand is going to be a pure continue. I think that I can raise at some frequency, but with the price I'm getting, I think a call is perfectly fine. I do continue with a call. We go to the turn with the pot at $375. The turn is the 9 of diamonds. And Richard decides to barrel for $150 into 375. Versus a larger sizing, my hand is probably going to be a pure fold. I don't think that my flush draw is necessarily going to be strong enough, especially on a paired board, to continue versus large sizes. Versus this smaller size, I think it's a little bit closer. Ultimately, I decide to make the call versus the small turn barrel with the plan to apply aggression on any rivers that Richard gives up on for the most part, and to try to get it all in if I do hit a heart. The pot is $675, and we go to the river, which is the 3 of diamonds. So no draws complete. Any king X is still essentially the nuts here. Richard does decide to check. I think when Richard checks here, he's weighted towards ace high and smaller pairs most of the time. And I think I want to be applying pressure against those hands. I definitely want to be applying pressure with my specific holding of 6 high. I don't think that my heart blockers are very relevant here. I think if Richard did have a flush draw that gave up, he's very unlikely to be holding the 6 or the 5 of hearts. As far as sizing, I think I generally just want to be shoving here, essentially having my value range consist of king X. I think that most of my pocket pairs below the king are just going to be checking back at a relatively high frequency. I do decide to shove and put Richard all in for $788, and he quickly folds. We have a straddle to $10 by Josue. I open under the gun with pocket 6s. I think pocket 6s is going to lean towards an open here the majority of the time, but definitely can be mixed when I'm under the gun. Hassan calls in the cutoff to my left with king of clubs, 9 of clubs. We go to a flop for $97. And the flop is the 3 of hearts, ace of spades, and 2 of diamonds. I think my hand is generally just going to be a check here, especially out of position. Definitely do have a nut and range advantage on this board when I'm opening under the gun, but I think my hand plays better as a check call the majority of the time. There's definitely some merit into betting though, just because my specific hand gains a lot from denial of overcards coming on the turn in river. I do check, and Hassan checks his king high back. The turn is the 4 of hearts, so now there is 4 to a straight on board, and I have a gut shot. I don't think that the straightening card really hits Hassan's range for the most part. He should have hands that are already ahead of me or overcards the vast majority of the time when we are in these positions. If anything, it gives me additional equity with the gut shot, and I think it's less likely that he's hit a pair. I do check, and he checks back once again. I think at this point his range is primarily going to be the Broadway section of cards and some medium pocket pairs that are under the ace that I'm losing to, so something like pocket 7s, pocket 8s. The river is the queen of spades. I check once again, and Hassan decides to bet here for about 33% pot with a sizing of $30. I think this is kind of a weird bet by him. I'd expect a queen to bet more for the most part as well, but I think a small size is probably fine with a queen. I think for the most part his range is essentially air or a queen. I don't think that he would be betting for value with a hand like pocket 7s, pocket 8s when the queen comes on the river. I tank for a little bit and do decide to make the call. I think I do need to call here a relatively high frequency when it checks down to the river and when I'm facing a small sizing. He shows the king high and we scoop. We have another double straddle. I open pocket eights to $75 in the cutoff. It folds around to Ragan. He looks down at pocket tens in the straddle and decides to 3-bet to $300. Ragan's hand is going to be a very high frequency 3-bet versus a cutoff open, and his size should be around 4x. Facing a 3-bet, my hand is going to be almost a pure continue, so I do call 225 more, and we go to a flop for $627. The flop is the 6 of diamonds, 8 of hearts, 4 of diamonds. So I flop top set on a somewhat wet board in a 3-bet pot. Definitely a board where Ragan is going to have a lot of overpairs. I think generally he should be sizing up on this board, probably closer to 50 to 60% pot, as he does have a strong nut advantage. He continues with a bet of $300. My specific hand can be a mix here. Call is perfectly fine. This board isn't really as wet as it would be in a single raised pot because there's very few straight draws that either of us can have, and the amount of flush draws is also diminished. But I decide to raise to $900 because Ragan and I are very deep, and he definitely has a very high concentration of overpairs in this spot. I make the raise to 900 and Ragan goes into the tank. After thinking for a couple minutes, he decides to jam all in for 3.3k. I think it's kind of a awkward spot for him. His pocket tens definitely are ahead of all of my draws here, which are going to be primarily diamond draws, and I could have a hand like pocket nines that he's crushing. I don't know how often he expects me to raise hands like top set here. I think many players are definitely slow playing this hand, and I think that he denies equity from a lot of my diamond draws. If I have something like 10-9 here, I can't really call, although he does block that. But I think his specific hand doesn't block most of my draws here. And I think specifically pocket tens doesn't necessarily want to see a turn and river card when there are a lot of overcards on the turn that could make my unpaired hands the best hand. I think him having specifically the 10 of spades and the 10 of clubs is much better for raising, because I think that if I did have a hand like, as it does unblock the majority of my draws though. I obviously snap call with top set and show him the bad news, and we scoop a $7,200 pot, the largest pot that I have ever won since I started playing poker. A hell of a hand to win an already solid session. This hand starts with Courtney limping in the hijack with Jack 5 offsuit. It gets to Ragan on the button and he opens to $80 with pocket tens. I look down at 7 of clubs, 6 of clubs in the big blind. I think for a little bit and ultimately decide to call. I don't think my hand is strong enough to 3-bet here. I generally probably want to be folding this hand, but I thought that if I called here, there was a good chance that Hassan would be calling in the straddle, and I thought that Courtney would be calling at a very high frequency as the initial limper. 7-6 plays relatively well multi-way, so I was fine going to a flop against these 3 players, even out of position. Hassan surprisingly decides to only call in the straddle with ace-king suited, and Courtney folds. So we go to a flop with a pot of $252. The flop is the 4 of hearts, Jack of diamonds, 9 of diamonds. So we flop essentially nothing, only a possible backdoor straights. I check in flow, Hassan checks, and Reagan decides to check back with pocket tens. The turn is the 3 of spades. I think that my specific hand can probably go either way. 7-6 is unblocking a lot of the draws that my opponents could have here. It is a hand that has very good implied odds if a 5 comes, and ultimately I only have 7 high. I'm typically not using massive sizes multi-way, so I decide to go with a 60% pot bet and bet $150 into 252. Hassan calls and Reagan overcalls. The pot is now $552 and we go to a river, which is the 4 of spades, completing none of the draws. I think that overall my hand makes a relatively good bluff, unblocking diamonds and the majority of straights. But in the moment, I'm concerned that the 4 specifically reduces a little bit of my value range and is a clear blank on the river. Both my opponents called my turn bet, so I'm unsure if a bluff will get through too often. I think that Hassan often has hands like Jack X and 9X that will call, and although Reagan checked on the flop, I think he still has some Jack X. I also think that if he has a hand like pocket tens or 9X, that he would call at some frequency if I bet and Hassan folds because all the draws missed. Ultimately, I decide to just check down my 7 high against 2 players. Hassan checks and Reagan checks back, and Reagan picks up this $700 pot with pocket tens. Unfortunately, I think that my bluff probably would get through here a decently high frequency, but my opponents were both slightly weaker than I would have expected in the moment. Overall, the second time on stream was a huge success. I definitely ran well in a couple of spots, but overall I thought I played well throughout the night. I ended up profiting around 8.3K and had a ton of fun. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and if you wouldn't mind, please liking and subscribing, as it will help grow the channel.